players in all of this has been California Product Stewardship Council and its executive director, Ms. Heidi Sanborn.
Thank you.
I'm very pleased that Heidi and Kimber are here. Several cycles ago in the HHW program, we were able to fund several grants to jurisdictions, and they used the services of Heidi and colleagues to implement many of the activities that you're going to hear about now. So with that, really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say about these HHW grants and the EPR components thereof.
Great, Howard. Thank you very much. I want to thank Carol Mortensen. I know she's not here, but for having us on the agenda today. We've been talking about doing this for over a year because there's been so many lessons learned from these grants that we feel that many, many people really should benefit from the knowledge that we've gained with public money. So, and I also want to thank the HHW team for giving us these grants and the local governments who actually executed them with our support. But some of these projects were what we call EPR transitional, in that producers are not paying for the whole program and designing the program, but that we've got different stakeholders in the product chain that are actually willing to be a collection center or pay for maybe just disposal or help with education. So they're shifting costs and responsibilities off of local governments purely off to the different stakeholders who are in the product chain. So that's why we call them EPR transitional. And let's see, I guess I can see this way. Can I go forward and backward? It doesn't seem to like to do that. She said to hold it flat, but that doesn't seem to work. Yeah, I'm doing backwards. It's not working. Yeah, oh, wait. Okay. Oh, I'm going to do something weird. Okay, so I'm going to let you do that. And so the agenda was basically, let you know again who we are, the grants that got awarded, the scopes of work that we did, and I'm only going to focus on the really key lessons that we learned. There's way more information. I could basically do an entire half hour on each one of these grants and what we learned and all the data, but we're going to focus on just the stuff that we think is most important, and then how those lessons can apply to our policy discussions of today. Next slide. So who we are basically at Product Stewardship Council is we're almost 6 years old now, if you can believe that. And we started as all local governments, but we actually now have 5 private sector members on our board. We've invited and have Republic Services, Ultimed, Amazon Paint Recycling, Providence Hospital Chain, and Marin Sanitary Service all sitting on our board now. So we're local governments, we're businesses. We even have producers on our board. Ultimed is the manufacturer of Sharps that we met through actually one of the workshops we did here on these grants. So we're a broad coalition working for this producer responsibility concept. Next slide. And we've always said that we shouldn't have disposal bans without management plans, but we have to thank DTSC because actually without the ban on universal waste disposal, we probably wouldn't have formed. It actually was very inspirational to local governments to think that the state's policy tool at the time was to simply ban things from disposal, because we know that doesn't work for the reasons stated on the slide. Next. And this is a great example. It's a picture taken at a San Diego landfill a year after the disposal ban went into play. Clearly, bans without plans don't work. It doesn't build the infrastructure. It doesn't build the funding that is needed, especially for something as expensive as fluorescent lamps. Next slide. So the grants that we did, the first one was an HD 16 cycle with the Del Norte Solid Waste Management Authority, and we focused on batteries and mercury lamps. The HD 17 cycle, we worked with Yolo County on Sharps and San Joaquin County on paint, which is what Kimber will talk about in a minute. And then the HD 18, which is with the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, a large council of governments in LA, and focused again on batteries and lamps. And then in the Del Norte Waste Management Authority again, but this time we were focusing on Sharps. So I'll first start on the next slide with a quick overview that we developed a lot of PR materials. They're done with public money. They're completely public. If you want to use any of the graphics or any of the information from our brochures, you're welcome to do that. We developed handouts for different audiences even. The consumer guide is the brochure on the left. The purple is the business-friendly, kind of explaining the business case to businesses, and then the local government brochure on the right. And I did bring some of those, and they're in the back. Next slide. We also did some workshops. These were the first workshops we did in April of 2008, believe it or not. And we were talking about fluorescent tubes at the time, and you can see in the back the TV camera. We were even getting, at the time, San Francisco ABC television watching this discussion because of the amount of public interest in these stories about what do they do with everyday common products they know are not supposed to be disposed of. Next slide. And then this is me talking at the next day we did a workshop on household batteries, which really led to, I think, a lot of partnerships and relationships that today are actually building into the legislation that we're working on now. And it also led us to do a couple of projects in Del Norte County, next slide, which included partnering with Call to Recycle, which is the stewardship organization for rechargeable batteries. And thankfully, they agreed to pay for all battery collection and recycling, not just doing their typical rechargeable batteries. And we used their same boxes. By making it easy for retailers, we increased the number of retail locations for those boxes from 4 to 25 in Del Norte. And of course, you know, Del Norte's way up on the coast. It's very small, very, very rural. So actually, that's a good number for them. And we saw an increase of 3,000% in battery collection in 1 year of the pilot. And that pilot is still working today. We are still collecting batteries, and the retailers are still promoting the programs and still have the window clings in the window. So that was a success in that partnership, that if we made it easy and we supported the retailers, the program would work. Next slide. We also took a small county, Tuolumne County, and we worked to get some of the local retailers to take back and pay for disposal, which is very challenging, for the mercury lamps and the batteries. This is right when the economy tanked. And we found 2 companies that would, Twain Hart Lumber and another hardware store. And these were the boxes. We got MDS disposal. We set them all up with these return boxes. And it worked great, but unfortunately at the end of the grant period, they decided if the state wasn't going to level the playing field and pass legislation, they were not going to continue the collections because they just couldn't afford the disposal costs. So this is where it really makes the case that we need level playing field, because these retailers can't compete against other retailers that don't do this, don't pay those disposal costs, because they have to increase their product prices to cover that, which is why statewide programs are better. Next slide. So some of the lessons that we learned on this were the convenience in advertising, again, is the key to the high collection rates and store participation. Getting the retailers to participate actually isn't that bad as long as you pay those disposal costs and provide support, which includes in-house training. That is time consuming. It's not easy. It has to be done, though. And then you need to eliminate these battery taping requirements. That is really a hassle, and a lot of retailers didn't like it. And ensure the displays are attractive and visible. That was a major issue. And large stores like IKEA, we found out, we tried to do a program in Chula Vista with them, but their corporate attorneys are not likely to participate in these kinds of programs. If it's not mandated, they're just probably not going to do it. Next slide. Other lessons that we learned, that it's just not feasible to do these kind of programs without financial support. It was very expensive and very time consuming. It could be done much more cost effectively at a statewide level by people that work with multiple jurisdictions and with a single message. And then also, you know, it did make the case for statewide policies, because it's difficult to convince those retailers again to pay those end-of-life costs if they're competing against others who aren't. Next slide. So I'll quickly talk about the YOLO Sharps project. We actually found out 2 pieces of information I thought you'd be interested in. Next slide. And this, we did a survey that we gave out with 4,000 drop-off containers for Sharps and 2,000 mail back to see what we got back for information, and also which containers were returned. And what we found out was very interesting from the survey. We had a mail back return rate of 11%, and the drop-off at the landfill was only 7%. However, they weren't paying the cost. This was all free because we paid for it with the grant. But if they had to pay, and this was in the product price, the actual mailbacks were around $20 a unit, and the drop-offs were about $5 a unit. So we're not sure if that would translate if they actually had to pay for the program. 84% of people stated that manufacturers should be financially responsible for their products, and 74% say the cost of disposal should be built into the price of the product. So we started realizing the public is really supportive of this when they're asked. And then of the respondents that are willing to pay more for the products to have it included in the price, 49% say they would tolerate an increase for needles of 50 cents a unit, and 32% would pay an extra $1 as long as they had a very convenient collection location for them that was built into the product price. So again, this is very good information that I don't think people had done before and collected this kind of information in a survey. There's more surveys that were done in the paint project, so I'll turn it over to Kimber real quick to talk about those, and then finish with a couple of other projects we did. Kimber? Oh, And I should say, Kimber Andrews was on our board and ran this paint project as a county hazardous waste management specialist for San Joaquin County for 7 years. So we're very lucky to have her. She joined us in February.
Thank you. Like Heidi said, I used to work for San Joaquin County, and one of the big projects that I had that we started in 2009 was the HD 17 project to set up a paint product stewardship pilot program. So with San Joaquin County, we partnered with San Francisco and Tehama County, and we wanted to get a good sense of what a statewide program would look like in a rural setting, an urban setting, and suburban setting, and hence the three partners there. And we developed the Be Paint Wise partnership name and logo to kind of brand the program, to have some consistent marketing. And I guess we can go to the next slide. And we'll skip this slide here. That's what I just mentioned. We'll go on from this. Next slide. And next slide. So our first objective, thank you, was really to promote source reduction, and we wanted to get a sense of what consumers were thinking. So we did a focus group study, and we partnered with the National Paint Product Stewardship Initiative and the American Coatings Association. We used the marketing materials that they had developed previously with the national project, and this is one example of a consumer with a closet full of paint. So we tested that along with some other materials. Of course, most consumers don't store their paint in closets, so this one was nixed. But we used the messages that were created nationally, and we kind of refined them for the California consumers. Next slide, please. And so with the focus group, we had a number of pretty interesting findings. The message, they said they wanted to see from a variety of sources, meaning they didn't really trust a message coming strictly from a government entity or industry or even an environmental group. They wanted to hear from a partnership, so a group of environmental organizations working with local government and industry was most trusted. Also, they preferred to receive educational materials at the point of sale, so at the location where they're buying the product, retail counter for paints. And also, only 1 in 20 of the participants knew where their local HHW collection facility was, and that really says a lot about consumer convenience. If they don't know where they can dispose of this material properly, they're not going to, of course, dispose of it properly. It might be stored, might be disposed illegally. So with that, next slide, we developed some educational material. We distributed it to 99 retailers in the 3 counties. Some were collecting paint, some were not. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And these materials were kind of rebranded, but basically the same message is now being used under the statewide program by Paint Care. The little table is to help consumers determine how much paint they need for their project, so they can look at the little table and at a quick glance figure out how much they need without over purchasing to reduce the amount of leftover paint that's being generated. Next slide. And also as part of the education and outreach, we did a total of 29 presentations to a variety of stakeholder groups. Some of the findings, which were really consistent with the YOLO project that we previously did, 92% of the participants said that EPR would be a useful way to decrease the burden on taxpayers for paint disposal costs. And 96% said that EPR laws would be a good way to incentivize green design, to give manufacturers incentive to make products less toxic and more easy to recycle. Next slide. And next slide. Skipping over some of these because we're short on time. So we worked with, in San Joaquin and Tehama County, Visions Paint Recycling was also the service provider for the stores that we recruited to collect paint. And we recruited 3 stores. Part of the project was to encourage the purchase of recycled content paint. So in San Joaquin, we still have 3 stores carrying Visions recycled paint, which is actually produced from the paint that's being collected under the program. Next slide. And so we recruited a total of 17 retailers in the 3 counties to participate, voluntarily collect paint from the public. Over the 13-month period, they collected almost 12,000 gallons of paint, which saved the counties almost $100,000 in paint disposal costs. So that was a pretty significant savings for the 3 counties participating. Next slide. So with the retailers, we realized that it took a lot of time and a lot of hand-holding, a lot of working directly face to face with the retailers to get them on board, to educate them about how the program would operate and make sure that it operated smoothly. Next slide. And with that, we also did a barrier study to determine what might motivate and what might prevent retailers from participating as a collection site for paint. And one of the things that we're still working with staff on is the regulatory requirements to make sure that local enforcement is consistent so that retailers are given the same message on what they can and cannot do and how they can operate the program. Also, one of the motivators, it was really emphasized by the employees, was concern about the environment and doing their part to protect the environment and giving back to the community. And we also saw that the employees were really positive about that. So next slide. So what we learned from the retail collection, the main thing is advertising. Promoting the program makes the retailers happy. When they see their name out there, it gives them more incentive to participate in the program. So next slide. And we also did, as part of the final objective for the project, was to promote the statewide program rollouts. During the grant term, the statewide law was actually passed, so the program was beginning to be implemented statewide, or at least talking about how it would be implemented. So now we have a statewide producer responsibility program for paint. And we worked with stakeholders at the end of this grant project to talk about how the program would roll out, talk about different issues, concerns that they might have. We did a series of conference calls, 5 webinars. We did a lot of press coverage to educate consumers, retailers, and other stakeholders that might be impacted by the statewide program. Next slide. And this is just an example of a lot of the press that we did. Next slide. And then finally, the lessons learned. Main thing was keeping the message simple and clear for everybody, consumers, retailers. And also, again, the public distress we found is pretty high. So a public-private partnership works best. Environment, government, and industry working together to get the message out to the consumers was the most effective. Again, advertising keeps the retailers happy. And finally, we found that large retailers, like Heidi mentioned before, don't necessarily participate unless they're incorporated into a statewide program. So, Heidi?
Thanks, and Kimbra is being very humble. That was a very major project that actually fed into the state law and the rollout of what you now see, some of those public education materials that we developed. Paint Care was actually in the back room watching us with the focus groups. They gave us the public education materials they had drafted for Oregon and actually changed them for California based on the results of this project. So there was a lot of good work done that actually is playing out now in the implementation of the statewide stewardship program. So next we'll go to the San Gabriel Valley Council of Governments, and this was a big research study. We did 2 things that I don't think have ever been done before. One is a statistically valid telephone survey of what people are currently doing with their batteries and lamps, and the other were focus groups, 2 for retailers and 2 for consumers. And of the retailers, one group actually already took back either batteries or lamps, and the other group did not. Next slide, and the one after. The survey, the conclusions were that we only had 1 store for every 70,000 residents in San Gabriel Valley that were actually taking back one of the other product. The national chain stores are better equipped to do the education outreach, but few of them actually do take back. And the local retailers believe that they can help consumers and send a good message by participating in the program, which is all true. Next slide. The focus groups were very interesting, and the one group that had retailers that had take back collections already were the only ones who really knew that batteries and lamps could not be disposed. Everybody else is throwing everything in the trash. So, and they didn't know if they should or shouldn't, could or couldn't, where their HHW facility was. So we have not done a good job since 2006 of getting the message out. People still don't know. Next slide. The lessons that we learned from these focus groups, it was very interesting to sit behind the glass and watch this discussion because we really didn't know what they were going to say. But they really understand that as purchasers of products, they're consumers. As taxpayers, they're taxpayers. And as ratepayers of garbage rates, they're ratepayers. They know that that's always going to roll down to them. But what they also get is when they purchase something, they have a choice. they don't feel they have a choice when they're actually paying taxes or garbage rates. They feel that there's very little understanding of what's in those rates, and they really understood that as a consumer, that it should be, if they're going to benefit from that product, they should pay. And that's fine with them up to a price. The consumers and the retailers were very clear that producers should be responsible, that it should be added to the product price in either internalized or visible fee. And they want the producers to make less toxic products. They don't understand why these things have to be this dangerous and banned from disposal. And one participant said, if they're going to be manufacturing these things, they need to be responsible. Next slide. And I've got the videotapes. They're very interesting to watch from those. Then we did that survey where 89% of consumers said that they would shop at a store where they go to buy where they would buy things at a store and go to the store if they got to recycle there. So that's great for retailers, great incentive. And 59% would travel 5 to 10 minutes further just to recycle. So that's another good story that Californians really want to recycle. Next slide. And most people are still buying in the big box stores. So without the big box store participation in the program, we're going to have problems, because the good news is that they want to return stuff, but if they're buying stuff at big stores and then they have to go somewhere else, that's extra trip, number one, and number two, we hope that they're buying from the smaller stores that have the take back, but often, sometimes that happens, sometimes not. Next slide. And we got 40 locations for all battery collections, so we have to thank Call to Recycle again for the boxes. Next slide. And the store that actually collected 1/4 of all of the batteries in the program for the 40 sites was an Ace Hardware in, what was that town? I'm going to forget now. I think it was, I can't remember. It was San Marino, I think. He actually took his recycling blue bin. He didn't like the little box that Call to Recycle gave him. He wanted a more colorful thing. He put signage by the door. And look at it, it was just full with batteries. Every time we'd walk in the store, it was full. And back up, next slide. Oh, no, the one after that. There you go. He put it right by the front door. And then he put signs all over it, pointing arrows down to this bin. And his staff, the clerks were right there, so they directed people to it, and they saw what was going in the bin. That's why they were getting so much. And they actually call this owner of the store, Jeff the Battery King. He took very big ownership over this program, and that's why he collected 25% of all the batteries we collected, which is now over 12 tons for 40 stores in just 2 years. Next slide. So we learned about marketing there and where to place these bins. We also did billboards. We had 3 paid and 2 for free all over the valley on freeways. Next slide. We did a lot of PR and a lot of free for local government. You can get on that public access channel. That helped. Next slide. Next slide. We've just got a lot of PR materials. You can use all of them. Next slide. And I'll do the next slide because I don't want to spend too much time on all of this. But next slide. There's so many materials that we did. This is actually one of the council members from Monrovia and I, and the store owner in the back from a camera store, which turned out to be a great location for battery collection because they have lots of batteries and cameras. And it was a great project. And we had press there and PR radio. And I had friends I hadn't heard in years. Hey, I heard you're in NPR down in LA today. So it was great press coverage. Next slide. So the bottom line is we did in a year and a quarter, 9,000 pounds at 40 stores. 25% of that was from that one store. So there's lots of information we learned, but the bottom line is ownership from the store, good signage, and the clerks paying attention. Next slide. On lamps, we had a much harder time because we did not have Call to Recycle like we did on the batteries paying disposal. Nobody wanted to pay disposal of fluorescent lamps. They're very, very, very expensive. We've heard as high as $7,000 a ton. Batteries, $2,000 to $3,000 a ton. We're talking serious money. So nobody wants to pay for it, and the best we could do is get Southern California Edison, thanks to our grant manager referral to them. We collected only 202 lamps and educated some people, but the truth is we don't have a good solution for fluorescent lamps in this state, and until we have legislation, I don't think we will. So we still have about 95% of them going in the trash. Next slide. So again, the lessons are basically the same as what Kimber and I were learning and going through this, is the public is really getting what producer responsibility is, not necessarily the term, but they get that the producers should pay and that they should pay. Next slide. Very quickly through Del Norte. There's a couple of key findings in this. Next slide. We have lots, again, model documents on procurement and language you can use, and all this is available to you on our website and through our office. Next slide. We did videos. You can use the clips. They're on YouTube. Very interesting. This happens to be a city council member from City of Napa talking about producer responsibility. Next slide. And again, purchasing is key, but it's very difficult in this economy to get anybody in local government focused on purchasing. They barely can buy things and keep the office running at this point. Next slide. But we did start an awards program with this grant, and it's still going on. In fact, we're open now for our 4th annual Arrow Awards for businesses. And our first grand Golden Arrow Award winner was the Greater Stockton Chamber of Commerce, much to our surprise. And since then, we've had great partnership with them, and we've even helped form the Build Infrastructure Now group, and working towards getting more jobs in recycling in California. So a call out to our friends down in Stockton Chamber and all the great companies that have won our awards. And apply if you're out there and you want to apply for this round. Next slide. We got national press on Sharps on this one. We even got in Diabetes Magazine because Sharps was the focus of this particular grant. Next slide. And we worked on locally take back of Sharps. Now this is another very problematic product. There's a lot of fear around taking back used needles, as you can imagine, biohazard, et cetera. But we did start with mailing 140 letters to the manufacturers of Sharps. And I'll read to you what we actually put into our grant report. The Solid Waste Management Authority received a phone call from the lawyer at the California Healthcare Institute, which is a lobbying organization working for many of the Sharps producers who received the letter. The lobbyist was clear that none of the clients who received the letter would participate or fund any type of effort, but he would not disclose which companies that were sent the letter, which were his clients. So that's basically the kind of response we get when we ask for any kind of partnership from the Sharps manufacturers, which is why, unfortunately, we had felt the need to introduce legislation this year. Next slide. And we did luckily find 2 local clinics that were willing to host a bin as long as the county paid for it. Nobody was willing to pay for it, no retailer. But we did get truck signs on the side of the garbage truck, which we thought was very applicable so that people knew, don't throw your needles in the trash. Next slide. And a brochure that we did. Again, graphics, everything's available to you to use. Next slide. Posters. Next slide. We just did tons of PR on this, and it really helped. The public really didn't know they couldn't throw them in the trash. They really thought some of them thought they could be recycled and put them in the recycling bin intentionally. Next slide. So the lessons we learned on this were basically we felt that we had no choice other than legislation because we tried everything with Sharps manufacturers and we weren't getting anywhere. The retailers weren't going to pay for disposal costs because they were very nervous about them being in their store. They're also very nervous about the cost. Hospitals and clinics would consider collection if somebody else paid for it. And then the stewardship awards, again, were a great way to build partnerships and also to give kudos to those companies who are doing good work. And I think we need to do more of that. Next slide. So what we learned in the big picture was these grants were absolutely wonderful education. These studies and surveys and focus groups, as far as we know, nobody else has done them in the country. And they are being used. We've done presentations all over the country with them. And they are the gifts that keep on giving because those projects that were funded by Call to Recycle, they're still operating, even though we've walked away for almost 2 years on some of those projects. The programs, the time and effort is needed. When you roll out a program, we've got a couple programs now where we don't have any staff in California working the entire collection program, and it's not going to work. I can tell you right now. I mean, that's just not what we found with these grants. You have to spend time, face time, meeting with the retailers, meeting with the stakeholders. And also, it made the case that the public really supports producer responsibility. They don't know the name EPR. They don't know what product stewardship means, but they sure get that producers make a lot of money off these products and should help share in end-of-life costs. So we thank CalRecycle for the grants. We thank the staff for the help, and we look forward to hopefully doing more of these in the future. And I'm happy to take any questions. You guys are all so quiet today.
Very good.
Yeah. Our old board meetings used to be way more lively.
Ouch.
John Cupps, independent consultant. Of the various programs that you implemented, Heidi, in terms of actual collection programs, which of those were, sustainable and are still ongoing in collecting material and so on and so forth?
The batteries were called Recycles paying the disposal in Del Norte and in San Gabriel Cog. All of those are still collecting. And they're still using the PR materials and the websites that we developed to promote the programs. The Sharps is still going in Del Norte, but again, we couldn't find anybody to pay the disposal costs. So it was really the county paying disposal costs, but they're doing a milk run, and we've got collections hosted at more convenient locations to the public, like the local clinic. And some of the outlying transfer stations where really there is nothing else out there except the transfer stations. So those are the ones that are sustainable. One store is still operating in Tuolumne County for batteries and lamps, but the other one did not continue.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a question at the back. While we're waiting for that, can I ask a question? Perhaps Heidi or Kimber knows this. Your surveys have been pretty much regional, but do you have any information on how those regional surveys and the findings there perhaps trend compared to statewide looks at the issue?
No, we did not do any statewide surveys. The region of LA was, urban. It was very urban, but it did have different economic strata, different types of demographics, but it definitely wasn't in rural areas, so I don't know if it would apply statewide. Mm-hmm.
Yes, Larry Sweetser on behalf of the rural counties ESJPA, and it wasn't more of a question, but just wanted to say on behalf of the ESJPA and our individual members who are members of CPSC that we do appreciate those efforts. Many of them have benefited directly, others indirectly by the efforts of CPSC. So we do encourage and support future funding considerations for extended producer responsibility. I do have a question on the earlier item on the HHW grants. I didn't have an opportunity for that earlier. For those jurisdictions that were eligible but not funded, do they have any preferential points for the next round of grants?
No, they don't. Because it'll be a whole different cycle with different criteria, new application process.
So if they don't fit that criteria, they're pretty much out of luck until the next
Well, they can submit a new application, but we wouldn't be taking their prior applications and just giving them that score for that new cycle.
Very good. Thank you for your question. I had one additional question, if I may. Again, from the surveys, the notion of distrust was identified several times.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, did anybody or did your survey participants articulate what they meant by that?
They don't trust anyone. They were very clear. They don't trust government. They don't trust private sector. They don't trust anyone. And the only way they're going to listen is if everybody gets together and agrees and messages the same, together. And so we took that to heart. And on the paint project, you saw all of our logos down the side. So, of course, we like partnerships. The problem is sometimes other people don't. So we just can't partner with ourselves. It was very clear. I mean, the words that they used and the tone that they took was very powerful. It's unfortunate. It felt like our public has become very cynical. But really, when you watch the news, I guess I don't blame them. But it was important for us to learn that. They also learned that they want to see it right at the point of sale. That's when they're thinking about the product and the end of life. They don't want to really hear it on the radio or over here, over there. It's when they're buying the product or when they're in that camera store, when they're in that hardware store. That's when they're thinking about it, and that's when the messaging was effective.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I think you can see there's a tremendous amount of information that Heidi and Kimber just really hit the high level pieces, and there's a lot more behind the scenes on these reports and some of the innovative things that they did with the surveys and the various setup programs and the lessons that we've learned. We'll be posting this PowerPoint presentation as soon as we can, so that'll certainly be available. Other information is obviously available. I think our legislative office, this is key information in terms of working with different committee members and legislators on EPR related bills, because there's specific bills on Sharps and so on and so forth, batteries. So I think this is it's a great project. It gave us a lot of information. We'll be looking again at the next household hazardous waste cycle in terms of what its criteria and scope should be. This is sort of foundational information that will feed into that. It's going to be fall timeframe. We don't have a date pinned down yet for that criteria item, but I want to thank Heidi for all her tireless efforts over the last 6-7 years on this issue, and all the folks who've joined CPSC and supported these issues. It's really has pointed out the need for statewide action, national action, but you know, so far it's the state level where things are